Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody. Welcome to the 10th and final episode of this scale model build series, Panther 44. If you've missed any of the earlier videos, you can turn back time and catch them using the link above. This video is where we're finally wrapping this thing up. There's going to be a ton of painting, a spot of weathering, and of course we will be adding all the final details that brings the diorama to life. So, without further ado, let's get cracking. We left the last episode with a black canvas covered in grass, ready for a good coat of paint. And that is where we are going to start, with a coat of XF52 Flat Earth mixed 50/50 with acrylic thinner. I airbrush the flat earth over all the areas that will have a dirt brown finish starting on the rear beaten track. I also go between all the grass areas, focusing on the patches where the ground is bare. It's not a big deal if some of the grass gets painted at this stage, as I will be painting it again later in a mixture of greens. Next is the main dirt road. You can see with the black primer coat under the brown, it's giving the road some different tones, highlighting cracks and bumps. With the road painted, I move on to the grass bank, again going over all the bare areas, ensuring there isn't any plain black patches. I also go over some of the flatter areas of the road again in the brown, to give it a bit more colour. This adds further difference to the surface finish. With the base layer of brown painted, it's time to paint the wall in a similar fashion, laying down a base coat of grey. For this I am using a mixture of XF54 dark sea grey and XF2 flat white. Apologies, but I cannot remember the ratio used, but it looked like this. I airbrush the entirety of the wall in this grey, which will act as the base coat to the plaster and also be the grouting colour. Even with only the base colours on, the whole thing is already looking a lot more alive. Now it's time to add a bit more variation to the dirt road finish. To do this, I mix up a heavily thinned brown paint using XF64 red brown with acrylic thinner at a ratio of 3:1. I then spray this finish around grassy areas and track marks, which darkens the mud tone, giving it the effect of more moisture in the ground. Having that variation in ground finish will act as a good base for further effects later on. With the base layers of the road and wall laid down, I move on to painting some bricks. I start by mixing up a combination of red, yellow, grey and white to create a range of brick red colours. These are diluted with tap water for easier application. With the colours mixed, I start painting the bricks individually, doing my best to avoid the grey grouting. I painted the first section and waited for it to dry to check the finish. It was a bit too vibrant for my liking, so I decided to dilute the colour down with some grey and white. With the paint adjusted, I paint over the bricks I just painted, then repeated that process over all the bricks on the model. Whilst I have some brick colours mixed, I cut out some loose bricks from a block of blue foam. Apologies for the bad camera angle, but in essence I measure the bricks, cut them out with a sharp scalpel, and shape them slightly with my fingers. Some I break in half to give me a range of shapes and sizes. When I have a decent amount of loose bricks cut out and moulded, I put them on the end of a cocktail stick and paint them all individually in the different brick colours, These are put aside to be attached to the diorama later on. Next up is another layer to the wall finish, this time mixing a white with a small dash of Luftwaffe grey, heavily diluted with water. This creates a light white wash that will create an inconsistent colour on the surface of the wall. You can see when I paint it on, initially it is quite a bold white finish, but as it dries it darkens and goes a bit patchy. These Vallejo paints are perfect for hand painting and creating effects like this. Being water-based means they paint very easily with a brush, and you can dilute them as much as necessary depending on how bold you want the colour. Next, it's time to paint the roof tiles using a mix of yellow, red and brown to create a range of terracotta colours. I play around with the ratios of the colours until I am happy with the range, and again these are diluted with tap water. As with the bricks, the tiles are painted individually in the different finishes. Although this takes a fair bit of time, I think it is well worth it for a natural effect. The top cap is painted in the same fashion, doing my best to avoid the grey filler. The final part of the roof to paint is the exposed beams, which are painted in a dark brown, again to be weathered later on. A spot of grass painting next, using a mix of dark green, cockpit green and yellow. I use these colours purely because that's all I had at the time. Obviously, if I had a pre-mixed grass green, I would have used that instead. When I am happy-ish with the colour, I start airbrushing the grass, being careful not to paint over any of the bare earth. I set the air pressure for the airbrush as low as I can. This stops the air blowing too much of the grass loose and also gives me greater accuracy. I keep going over all the grass elements on the scene. By applying a light coat, it allows some of the original colour to show. This only creates more difference between the blades of grass, stopping it from all looking identical. Once complete, I use a lighter green from Vallejo to hand paint some highlights. The paint sometimes won't soak into the grass how I would like, so I use the airbrush to lightly blow the paint, which disperses it into the grassy area. With the grass done, it's time to decorate our cake with the bricks I painted earlier, plus some stones made from epoxy putty. The positioning I never have planned for this kind of thing. I just play around with the positioning until I think it looks right, then stick it down with some PVA glue. PVA is perfect for this, as it has a slow drying time. If I want to move something, I can do very easily. Plus the glue dries transparent, so won't leave much of a mark if I do choose to move it. I also have a few other pieces I will add to the diorama to give the grass bank some character. I will paint these separately and place them later. As it stands, the bricks and stones are looking a little too clean for my liking. In reality, they would have grouting stuck to them still after being broken from the wall, so I need to paint that on. I mix up a diluted grey paint to use for this task and carefully paint some of the edges of the bricks. I also use this solution to paint the other broken parts of wall and also the stones. This just helps to blend them into the diorama slightly. For some parts where the paint looks too bold, I blend it into the brick by soaking the brush in tap water. Next, I add some field grey to my mixture. This I will use to paint the top slabs of the wall. I wanted these to look different to the wall and plaster finish, as in reality, they would have looked different, even if they were a similar colour. When picking stone colours, it doesn't really matter what they are, as long as they keep a similar tone with the rest of the model. It's the slight differences that we are after. With the main bulk of the paintwork on the diorama complete, it's time for some weathering. I whip out the trusty Winsor and Newton oil set and decant some colours onto some card. The card will soak up some of the oil from the paint, which in turn will aid drying time. Whilst the card is working its magic, I prepare the model with a coat of satin varnish. This will protect the paintwork from the white spirit, of which will be used to dilute the oil paints. I also paint the grass with the satin varnish. This is purely to add a small bit of shine to the otherwise flat green colour. Once the clear coat has dried, I mix up the first wash, using a mix of the two brown colours. I use a cocktail stick to decant some into a mixing tray and add white spirit to create a wash. I also decant extra white spirit so I can blend the wash where necessary. I test the finish on the roof first and find it is a little too light and not showing up as I would like, so I add a small amount of black to the mixture to darken it a tad. Then it's back onto the roof, using capillary action to draw the oil wash into the joints and gaps in the roof tiles. This effect is good for highlighting details, but also gives the tiles a dirty effect and makes them look older. The beams are given a coat to roughen them up a bit and help them blend with the rest of the structure. The wash is also used to highlight the cracks in the plaster and also the detail on the brickwork. In my opinion, oil washes is the easiest way to add some depth to models as well as highlighting details. It is also incredibly cost-effective. A box of oil paints will last an absolute age as long as the caps are shut correctly. When I am done with the wall, I move on to adding some further tone on the dirt path and road. I focus on track marks and details that I want to highlight further. Next, it's time for a lighter wash. I add some white along with the remains of some brown to create this light, murky colour. I then use this lighter wash to streak the walls, adding rain marks and further variation to the finish. The same effect is also added to the tiles, adding the wash, then using a clean white spirit-soaked brush to blend. That is the main bulk of the weathering complete. Next, it's time to build a wooden gate for the arch. I start by drawing out a template and measure out enough wooden stirrers to fill one gate. Next, I glue in place two cross braces using Loctite. Not worried about them being too big at this stage. I just want a solid base to work with. I clean up the excess super glue from the face of the gate, then draw around a template I traced and cut out of paper. To cut out the shape, I used a pair of old snips. It's fairly simple to do, but be warned, the ends fly off at quite a pace. Some protective eyewear would also be a good shout for this task. Next, it's time to cut out and stick in place the support brace for the gate. Before you all shout at me, I know, the support is the wrong way round. I don't know how I managed it. I even watched an entire video about gate braces prior to making these, and still got it wrong. Once glued and stuck in place, I move on to the hinges. I drew up and 3D printed these workable hinges in resin. These I glue into position using some CA black. That's the main bulk of the gate built. So next, I give them a good coat in this wood stain I had left over from my desk build. I treat this as I would staining any other piece of furniture, try to brush with the grain as much as possible and give it time to soak into the wood. I paint the hinges next in German grey. I want them to look like they were painted black once upon a time. I also modelled and printed these brackets to go on the front of the gates. These I paint in the dark grey on the sprues purely for ease. Next I mix a lighter grey to add some chipped areas. This will enhance the rust effects that I will be adding once dried. Now for the rust tones, as I would do when painting tracks, I give the hinges an all-over coat of the dark rust first. This gives a deep rusty feel to the whole thing, which I will highlight with the light rust tones after. The same is applied to the little brackets as well. The final effect is the light rust wash. This I use over the light grey painted chipped areas to resemble surface rust. It's not all that clear, but it's a little something to add some difference to the metalwork. Again, this is applied to the metal brackets for the fronts of the gates. With everything built, painted and weathered, I fit the brackets to the front side of the gates using some black CA glue. To fit them to the diorama, I mark the hinge positions, then push a small hole in the surface using some needle nose tweezers. Apologies for the bad camera angle here, but all I am doing is fitting the hinge spike into the holes I have just created. I don't use any glue here. They are nicely wedged in place. And that's the gates complete. Next, it's time to paint the remaining details of the diorama. I wanted some old bits of left-behind kit to litter the grass bank and give another point of interest to the scene. The first task is to give them a good coat of black primer. If you are finding this video helpful, or even mildly entertaining, can I please ask you hit those like and subscribe buttons, and please do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you. When the primer coat is laid, I start with some olive drab elements. These are for the wheel, the remains of the 6-pounder and the jerry can. I found the Tamiya olive drab is quite dark straight from the jar, so I add some yellow to lighten it a tad. I then give the items another light coat, which highlights the panels. These items are like mini projects themselves, so I will try to whiz through them a wee bit. Next is the wooden box, which I hand paint, using this pale brown. When painting wooden objects, it's best to try and paint along the grain as much as possible. This gives the surface more of a wooden texture. Being a black primer, it took around 3 coats to give it a nice finish. The final object is the Panther protective plate, being painted in German yellow. This was left over from my Meng Jagdpather kit, which I bent up a bit before priming. Next, it's time for some 2-part chipping, starting with the olive drab. I mix up a lighter green using olive drab and yellow. This will act as the lighter chipped areas. I then use the sponge chip method to apply to the model. I want these things to look pretty beaten up, so I apply quite a lot of chips, focusing on edges and raised details. I then join some of the chips together using a fine brush. This allows me to have more control over where I will apply the raw metal later on and refines the chipping a wee bit. Unfortunately, the green wasn't quite light enough and didn't really show up once it dried. So I remixed the light green, adding some white, and repeated the process. The same is done on the jerry can and the spare wheel. I have a more comprehensive video on chipping in this series on the Panther itself, in case you want to check it out. Next, the same is applied to the dark yellow. I find the Vallejo German yellow is a perfect level of lightness to chip over the Tamiya dark yellow finish. Now it's time to add the chips that have worn down to raw metal. I mix German grey with a little white to give me my steel colour. Then it's just a case of filling in the lighter chips with some dark grey. This is the fiddly part, but almost the easiest. The sponge chipping acts like a template, telling you where to apply the dark grey. For the Panther side armor plate, I used the sponge again to apply it over the light chips. I was getting a bit lazy by this stage, but in actual fact it worked a lot better than I thought. I then refined it a wee bit with the brush, focusing on edges where the paint will have totally come off. With the chipping done, the last bit of painting is the tire on the wheel. For this I mix black and blue together to give me a rubber black. I then carefully paint the tire, being extra careful not to ruin the paintwork on the wheel itself. More rust effects next. Pretty similar to how I did the hinges, but this time I only put the dark rust over the chipped areas and blend with the white spirit. After the dark is applied, I move to the lighter rust tones, applying over the chipping to give the impression of surface rust on the raw steel. Again, I have covered rust effects in a previous episode of Panther 44 in more detail, and will most certainly be doing more in the future, so whizzing through this effect here. Back to the diorama now. I'm applying some of this Woodland Scenics fine turf to the model. This stuff at 1/35th scale makes a really good moss. To apply it, I simply add PVA glue to the areas I want the moss, then apply the fine turf and get rid of the excess. It's pretty much the same process as the glitter painting I used to do as a child. Next, I place the accessories on the grass bank. I don't use any glue here. The power of gravity will hold these in place. Next up, it's time for the final touches, starting with these little bushy bits by AK Interactive. These are pretty nicely colored straight from the box, so no need for painting. To apply them to the model, again, I whip out the diluted PVA and apply to areas I want the shrubs. Then I simply push them into place. The glue will dry clear, so there's no need to worry about overspill. These accessories by AK are a really good addition to any diorama to bring a little life to the scene. The final effect is the application of some dust. This will help blend all the elements together and give the impression of a dusty scene. For this, I am using European Earth Pigment by Ammo and applying straight from the pot. I apply with a brush and dry blend until I have a subtle dusty effect. The key to these pigments is to go steady. It's very easy to apply too much and completely cover all the hard work we have previously put in. Sometimes less is more. Last thing to do is give the base another coat of black. Extra care is taken here to not paint any of the top surface. By holding the airbrush level or in an upward angle, this ensures this is the case. And there we go, diorama complete. I can't quite believe we have got to the end of this build series. It has been quite a long road, to say the least. If you have got this far in the video and have been following the journey, all I can say to you is fair play, and thank you very much for your support. It really has been a cracking build, this one. A lot of ups and downs, a lot of things learnt, and an amazing base for better things to come. Well, that's it for the series Panther 44. Next up, I will be tackling a 1/48 scale Fokker Wolf, so stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you for watching and happy modeling, everybody.